We want to welcome everybody here to the United States Capitol Historical Society's ongoing series about the role of Congress and the work of the Capitol. We are an organization that was chartered by Congress and funded by the people who believe in understanding public history and civic education. And so we thank you for your support and your investment in this work. Today, our series will continue as we join in a captivating talk with author and historian, political scientist, Jordan Tama. Together, we will discuss his most recent book, Bipartisanship and U.S. Foreign Policy, which couldn't be a more timely topic as we face real foreign policy challenges. His book focuses on important U.S. congressional votes between 1991 and 2020. And in this era of ever-increasing polarization in the United States Congress, American foreign policy continues to remain marked by frequent bipartisanship. Jordan Tama shows in his book that even as polarization in American politics reaches new heights, Democrats and Republicans in Washington do find ways to cooperate on important international issues. And looking closely at congressional voting patterns and foreign policy spending, Tama reveals that bipartisanship remains more common than we think when U.S. officials turn their attention overseas. But let us understand that bipartisanship today does rarely involve complete unity. Instead, bipartisan coalitions spanning members of both parties often coexist within inter-parties divisions or disagreement between Congress and the president, making it difficult for the United States to speak with one voice on the global stage. Drawing on new data and interviews of about 100 foreign policy practitioners, this book documents the persistence of bipartisanship. And we really look forward to this distinguished speaker because it is a time where we must understand how can we respond to the foreign policy challenges we have. Jordan Tama is a provost associate professor at the School of International Service at American University, a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and a noted author about the politics and process of U.S. foreign policy, explaining how U.S. leaders conduct foreign policy and why they act the way they do when they turn their attention overseas. Professor Tama, thank you for being with us. We look forward to your conversation. Help us to understand how our leaders in Congress come together around foreign policy. Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Jane, and I'm really grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to talk to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society membership about my new book and my research on bipartisanship in foreign policy. I'm grateful to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for organizing this webinar and the other great events that the Society puts on, and also grateful more generally to the work that the U.S. Capitol Historical Society does to promote more understanding of our Capitol and the political process, key foundations of our democracy, particularly at this time where some of those foundations of democracy are being challenged in very important ways. So I'm going to be focusing today on themes that I discuss in my new book, as Jane said, which is called Bipartisanship in U.S. Foreign Policy. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some slides that I've prepared, and I'm going to talk through these slides as I go forward. The first slide is the front cover of the book, which is an image of Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer looking friendly towards each other. And this is not their typical demeanor towards each other. If you've followed American politics in recent years, you probably would have the sense that these two politicians really don't like each other very much. And I think that's largely true. But they have actually cooperated with each other on many important issues, on various pieces of legislation. And right now they're cooperating on important foreign policy issues. They're cooperating to try to get Congress to approve aid for Ukraine, aid for Israel. They're putting together a legislative package that will include aid for those two countries, as well as aid for Taiwan, border security funding. And their hope is that they can kind of forge a bipartisan coalition in the Senate and then induce the House to approve this legislation. But of course, the House is currently not operating. It does not have a speaker, and it's unclear when it will start operating. And when it does, it's unclear if it will pass that type of legislation, because as I'll discuss in my talk, the Republicans are now split over aid for Ukraine, and many of the House Republicans don't want to approve aid for Ukraine. I'll say more about that in a moment. But the theme of this book is, as Jane mentioned, that there is still bipartisanship in U.S. foreign policy. Now, you might think, gosh, that sounds like an overly optimistic take. If you just look at anything going on in American politics these days, it looks like there isn't bipartisanship. It looks like Democrats and Republicans are at each other's throats, and that is largely true. There is very high levels of polarization in American politics these days. And there's also polarization on many foreign policy issues, as I will describe. And so the theme of the book is not that everything is hunky-dory. It's not that Democrats and Republicans are all getting along on foreign policy. It's just to point out that even as our politicians are polarized in many respects, there are still some important issues, and especially there are important foreign policy issues where Democrats and Republicans are cooperating. And I'll say more about that as I go forward. So first, just a word about, why is my slide not advancing? There we go. Okay, first, just a word about the broader context here and polarization. So before we get to bipartisanship, it's important to understand the phenomenon of partisan polarization, which is a defining characteristic of American politics today overall. So what is partisan polarization? Well, it's a term that's used all the time, but it's helpful to, I think, define it specifically. So partisan polarization is marked by two features. One is the division of people into more distinct political groups. And then secondly, growth in the size of the gap separating those groups. So if you imagine a collection of Democrats and Republicans, when polarization is occurring, first of all, they're congealing into two distinct groups, one group of Democrats, one group of Republicans that are distinct from each other. And then secondly, they're moving apart from each other in some sense. And the way they're moving apart can have multiple dimensions. So one way that polarization can be manifest is that Democrats and Republicans have increasingly different policy views. This is what we would call ideological polarization. It's when the policy ideas, policy views, preferences of Democrats and Republicans move farther apart from each other. And that's probably the most common way that people think about polarization. But there are also other dimensions of it. Polarization can also involve Democrats and Republicans developing more negative feelings towards each other. And political scientists call this affective polarization. That's the affective term there is referring to the feelings that people have about other people. And if Democrats and Republicans are developing more negative feelings towards each other, then there's affective polarization. Then the third important way that polarization can be manifest is in people's social behavior. We can call this social polarization. When Democrats and Republicans don't socialize as much with each other anymore, when they live in different places, congregate in different places. And in America today, there has been a significant degree of geographic polarization, where different parts of the country are markedly different from each other in terms of the prevailing political views and political voting behavior of the people who live in those places. So for instance, urban areas tend to be much more democratic than rural areas. And this type of polarization can exist among politicians or among the public. Any of these kinds of polarization can exist in both spaces. So that's sort of what polarization is. What about the rise in polarization? So there is, as I think many people are aware, a trend in recent decades of increased polarization in American politics. What people may not always realize is that this trend goes back to the 1960s, 1970s. So the kind of era of minimal polarization in American politics was the 50s, 60s, 70s. During this time, there were conservative Democrats and there were liberal Republicans. Particularly in the South, there were many conservative Democrats. Many of the most conservative politicians in the country were Democrats, Southern Democrats. In the North and the Northeast, Midwest, there were many liberal Republicans. Today, those terms are almost oxymorons. We don't really have conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans anymore in the United States. Those categories of people are pretty much extinct. And also, several decades ago, it was common for Americans to vote for a Democrat in one election and a Republican in the next. Voting behavior was not as fixed to one party as it is now. Now people almost, who vote for Democrats in one election are almost always going to vote for a Democrat in the next election, same on the Republican side. And ideological, affective, and social polarization are all high. This is a graph. Don't worry about all the specifics here, but if you just look at these colored lines, what they're showing is a trend since the 1970s. I'm only going to be showing a couple graphs, then I'll get to some stories. A trend from the 1970s to today in terms of the voting patterns of Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate. And the lines you can see are moving apart from each other as you go down. In the more recent period, which is showing the years 2021 to 2022, Democrats and Republicans are voting apart from each other more often than they were in the earlier decades that are higher up on the graph in both the Senate and the House. And there's been greater movement to the right among the Republicans than there has been to the left among the Democrats, but both parties have moved farther apart from each other in terms of their voting patterns in Congress. I think even more striking is how Democrats and Republicans say they feel about each other. And this is the public here, not politicians. So these numbers represent people's responses to a question that has been asked every 4 years in an election survey called the American National Election Study. It's conducted during every presidential election every 4 years. And in this question, the pollsters ask people as they're going to the polls, how do you feel about members of each party on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 would be a very cold feeling and 100 would be a very warm feeling. And the top two lines, the blue and red, represent how Democrats and Republicans feel about people in their own party. The blue is Democrats, the red is Republicans. Unsurprisingly, people have pretty warm feelings generally towards people in their own party. The bottom two lines, the dashed lines, and again, the blue is Democrats and the red is Republicans, represent how people feel about members of the other party. So the Democratic dashed line is how do Democrats feel about Republicans, and the Republican line is how do Republicans feel about Democrats. And you can see that in the 60s and 70s, people felt kind of lukewarm about members of the other party. The answers were around 50 on this 0 to 100 feeling thermometer. In recent years, the feelings have been colder, and in the 2020 election, it was down at 20. That's pretty remarkable. Democrats and Republicans feel very coolly towards members of the other party now. Almost cold toward members of the other party. So that's the sort of negative part of the story. Now, what is bipartisanship? Well, bipartisanship, term that's used all the time, so it may seem intuitive, but I want to kind of break it down a little bit for you because I'm going to explain that bipartisanship can be manifest in a few different ways. Generally, bipartisanship involves agreement or cooperation between members of two parties. But in my book, I explain that there are multiple types of bipartisanship, particularly when you take into account not just how members of Congress are interacting with each other, but also how they interact with the president. And this is especially important on foreign policy, where Congress sometimes supports the president's position, sometimes challenges the president's position. So one type of bipartisanship is pro-presidential bipartisanship. This is when members of both parties support the president's positions. There's also anti-presidential bipartisanship. This is when members of both parties oppose presidential positions. And when that happens, that's a pretty striking event because you wouldn't think that members of the president's own party would be opposing the president, but this actually happens fairly regularly on foreign policy. And then thirdly, there's what I call cross-partisanship, and this is very common. This is when there are internal divisions within the parties, and that as a result, there are competing bipartisan coalitions. So in other words, if you imagine a situation where an issue is coming up in Congress and both parties are split on the issue, then you would have one bipartisan coalition on one side of the issue and another bipartisan coalition on the other side of the issue. And this actually happens a lot. So in those cases, there's not bipartisan unity, but there's also not polarization. So now I'm going to show a couple of graphs from data that I collected on congressional votes between 1991 and 2020. And I'll walk through what this graph shows. So these are all the votes that were taken in Congress on important issues between 1991 and 2020. And here they're broken down by decade, 1990s, then the 2000s, and then the 2010s. The blue bars represent foreign policy votes, and the orange bars represent domestic policy votes. And the height of the bars represents the percentage of votes that on which a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted the same way. In other words, the height of the bar represents the percentage of votes in which there was substantial bipartisanship, a majority of Democrats and majority of Republicans voting on the same side. And what the graphs show is that overall, there's more bipartisanship on foreign policy than on domestic policy. The blue bars are higher than the orange bars across all 3 decades. Secondly, they show that the rates of bipartisanship are declining over time. So in the first decade here in the 1990s, about 2/3 of the votes featured a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voting the same way. In the most recent decade, the 2010s, a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted the same way, about 53% of the time on foreign policy and about 36% of the time on domestic policy, significantly lower rates than in earlier decades. So that shows that polarization has been increasing, bipartisanship has been declining in both foreign and domestic policy. But what's also notable is that there are a lot of issues, as I mentioned, where the parties are internally divided. And so while this previous graph is just simplifying things into either being polarized or bipartisan, here I break things down with a little more nuance to look at what about the frequency with which there's division within one of the parties. And that's what I call cross-partisanship. Cross-partisanship here is capturing all the votes on which at least 10% of the members of a party vote against the prevailing position within their party. And so you can imagine if at least 10% of the members of a party vote against their party's majority, there's substantial internal division within that party. And what the graph shows is on about 2/3 of the foreign policy votes, there is this kind of internal division. So typically there's neither strong polarization nor strong bipartisanship. Here, strong polarization would be a case where at least 90% of the Democrats vote opposite, vote differently than at least 90% of Republicans. And strong bipartisanship would be a situation where at least 90% of Democrats and 90% of Republicans vote the same way. And the majority of votes don't fall into either of those categories. Again, this is important votes from this is showing all the votes from 1991 to 2020. So this is important congressional votes between 1991 and 2020. Third, and this will be then my last graph. It's also, as I mentioned, important to understand how is Congress relating to the president? Is Congress supporting the president? Is Congress opposing the president? Or is Congress kind of split on an issue that the president cares about? Here, I'm showing data from a subset of those important votes that I was talking about. These are all the votes between 1991 and 2020 on which the president took a public position. So these are votes that are important to the president, because the president doesn't always take a position on legislation. But when the president does take a position, you know it's something that the president cares about a good deal. So among all the votes that on which the president took a position between 1991 and 2020, there are a substantial number where a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted with the president. That's pro-presidential bipartisanship. About 20% of the votes were like that. But there's also a substantial share of foreign policy votes where a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted against the president. And that's the blue bar in the middle above anti-presidential bipartisanship. So about 15% of the time when the president takes a position, a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans vote against the president. 15% might not sound like a lot, but again, it's pretty striking when a majority of Democrats and Republicans are voting against the president, because it means a majority of the president's own party are voting against the president. And so it's notable that that happens, even that often. Okay. Now, how about some pictures and some stories? Okay, so this is a comic book strip that I had made. I don't expect you to be able to read this because it's too small on this screen, but I then break it down to show you each of these 4 panels. These comic strip panels represent each of the 4 kind of types of political alignments that I was talking about. And the first one is pro-presidential bipartisanship. And I have an illustration on each slide of a recent issue where this political alignment has been manifest. So this is illustrating how US politicians might react to a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And the basic idea here is that when it comes to US policy toward China today, there's a lot of bipartisanship and Congress is largely on the same page as the president. Overall, the president and members of Congress favor strong steps to counter China, to compete with China, to try to limit Chinese influence in different parts of the world, strengthen the US position vis-a-vis China in Asia. And this was true under Donald Trump. It's true under Biden. Trump and Biden in many ways have similar policies towards China. And it's true in Congress, where there's been strong bipartisan support for kind of tough stances toward China, policies designed to counter China. And the image here is showing Joe Biden saying we need to stand up against authoritarianism, Donald Trump saying we need to make China respect us again. And then on the bottom, it's actually Bob Menendez and Marco Rubio. I had these slides, this comic made before Menendez got into big trouble. And so he's on here, although if I made it today, I would replace him with Ben Cardin, who has replaced him as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But the point here is that all these people favor tough stances toward China. What about anti-presidential bipartisanship? So this one is a little less intuitive, but it also occurs regularly, as I mentioned. So here is an example that I discuss in my book of Donald Trump trying to cut the budget of the State Department and the US Agency for International Development by a lot. He tried to cut the budgets of those agencies, which are responsible for diplomacy and foreign aid, by about 1/3. He's depicted here as Edward Scissorhands, if you have seen that movie from a while back. And there are a number of members of Congress here who are trying to protect the budget of the State Department from these cuts. And that's Lindsey Graham saying, that's Trump saying, I can handle diplomacy myself and foreign aid is a waste. I'm cutting that budget. And then there's Lindsey Graham saying, we need a strong State Department to keep America secure. And Senator Pat Leahy saying, we need a strong State Department to address all kinds of global challenges. Graham and Leahy, for many years, and including during the Trump administration, were the chairperson and ranking member, meaning the senior members of the 2 parties in the Senate, on the committee responsible for appropriations for the State Department and foreign aid. And they have been strong supporters of funding the State Department and foreign aid. Also depicted here is Nita Lowey and Kay Granger, 2 members of the House who were the chairperson and ranking member of the House committee responsible for spending on diplomacy and foreign aid. And they resisted Trump's budget cuts plans and maintained the State Department's budget at roughly constant levels through the Trump years, even though Trump was trying to cut the budget by about 1/3. Another story and illustration of one of these concepts. So there are also times when Congress is strongly polarized on a foreign policy issue. One example of that has been diplomacy with Iran in recent years. So this is depicting Barack Obama signing the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often known as the Iran nuclear deal, in 2015. That was the deal in which the United States agreed to lift various sanctions on Iran in return for Iran accepting constraints on its nuclear program. And here you've got Donald Trump saying this is a terrible deal, you're letting Iran walk all over us. And Kerry is saying that this is the best way to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Since during 2015 and since then, there's been a sharp divide between Democrats and Republicans on diplomacy with Iran. Republicans universally opposed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Trump pulled out of it. Democrats have been more supportive of that agreement and other efforts to engage in diplomacy with Iran, and that remains true to this day, although in response to the recent Hamas attacks on Israel, Democrats have also been strongly criticizing Iran. I'll get to that more contemporary issue in a moment. Okay, next issue. My next slide clicker is not functioning as well as I would like. Hang on a second here. Okay, there we go. Cross-partisanship. I mentioned this is the situation where there are internal divisions within one or both parties, and this leads to bipartisan coalitions on both sides of an issue. One issue where this has been evident in recent years has been with some debates over U.S. military intervention. And that was true with regard to the U.S. response to the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria that broke out in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring. And you may recall rebels in Syria rose up against the government of Bashar al-Assad. Some Democrats and some Republicans in the United States thought the U.S. should intervene in that conflict to assist the rebels or prevent the rebels from being slaughtered by the Assad government. And there were mass atrocities being carried out by the Assad government. Some Democrats and Republicans thought the U.S. had a humanitarian need, a moral obligation to intervene to save lives in Syria, or thought that the United States should intervene to counter Iran because Iran is a close ally of the Assad government of Syria. On the other hand, there were many Democrats and many Republicans who thought the U.S. should not intervene in this conflict, either because they thought U.S. intervention would not be effective, or they thought the U.S. is better off not being too involved in the Middle East, or they thought that it would be too expensive and they wanted to hold down U.S. defense spending. And so you had bipartisan coalitions on both sides of this issue, and the U.S. did not end up intervening. What about a few other issues, some very recent issues that have occurred during the Biden administration? One example of pro-presidential bipartisanship during the Biden years has been NATO expansion. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration pushed to expand NATO to admit Sweden and Finland. The Senate had to vote on this because the Senate has the authority to consider and ratify treaties. And all but one U.S. senator voted to add Finland and Sweden to NATO. You can see here a vote total as it was, the voting was almost finished in the Senate. It was 94-1 at this point, and the final total had a few more yeses, but still only one no. So very strong bipartisan support for NATO expansion, and that's been true with other rounds of NATO expansion since the end of the Cold War. NATO has been expanded several times with strong bipartisan support in the U.S. Climate change policy. Here's an issue where there's been strong polarization. So a different political alignment. These images on the left are showing President Biden signing the Inflation Reduction Act last year, surrounded by congressional Democrats. This was the law that wasn't really about inflation, but was mainly focused on incentivizing transition to green energy, investing in clean energy technologies in the United States. It had a lot of incentives for things like producing electric batteries and other green energy technologies. The legislation was approved entirely on party lines in Congress. Not a single Republican voted for it. So that's a case of strong polarization. And on the right, I've got an image here of Senator James Inhofe. He retired at the end of this past year, but for many years he was the chairperson or senior Republican on the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate. He's a climate change denier. He is holding a snowball here on the floor of the Senate after a snowstorm in Washington, D.C. to try to make the point that, look, it just snowed, so climate change is not a real thing, and there's no need for the government to do anything about it. What about Ukraine policy? So here the politics have been complex and have shifted over time. So during the last year of the war in Ukraine, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was strong pro-presidential bipartisanship in support of the Biden administration's approach of providing strong support for Ukraine, high levels of military aid for Ukraine, as well as various steps to counter Russia, like the imposition of sanctions on Russia. The image on the left is showing Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky addressing a joint session of Congress last year, receiving a standing ovation from Democrats and Republicans, and Congress passed several rounds of military assistance for Ukraine last year in strongly bipartisan votes. Now, Democrats are still largely united behind Biden's approach of providing high levels of military aid and other support for Ukraine, but the Republican Party is split over aid to Ukraine. So there's the more kind of internationalist wing of the Republican Party. This includes members of Congress like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, as well as presidential candidates like Nikki Haley and Mike Pence, who are strongly pro-Ukraine and are arguing that the United States needs to support Ukraine in order to defend peace and democracy overseas and stand up to authoritarianism and aggression from Russia. On the other hand, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party has become very opposed to supporting Ukraine. This has been led by Donald Trump, who opposes aid to Ukraine, and also other members of Congress in the MAGA camp, particularly in the House and on the campaign trail, people like Vivek Ramaswamy, Ron DeSantis, now call for the United States to not provide any more aid to Ukraine. The image on the right is Haley and Ramaswamy arguing over aid to Ukraine in the first presidential debate. Haley was arguing the U.S. should support Ukraine, and Ramaswamy was saying the U.S. should not. Last issue, the one that's been most in the news the last couple of weeks, the war between Israel and Hamas. So far, in terms of the politics in the U.S., this has been an issue where the predominant political landscape is one of pro-presidential bipartisanship in support of Israel. Biden, of course, has taken a very strongly pro-Israel stance in response to the Hamas attack on Israel. And most members of Congress have also taken strongly pro-Israel stances. Last week, these two members of the House, on the left, it's Republican Michael McCaul, the Republican chairperson of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and on the right is Gregory Meeks, the Democratic ranking member, the senior Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They introduced a resolution last week, several days after the Hamas attack on Israel, that expressed strong support for Israel and called for the United States to provide more military aid to Israel. This resolution immediately got about 390 co-sponsors in the House, and that's out of a total of 435 members of the House. So it means almost all Democrats and almost all Republicans signed on to this resolution right away in support of a pro-Israel position. At the same time, though, there's been some contentiousness, and there are signs of some emerging divisions within parties on this issue. So some Republicans, many Republicans, have tried to pin the blame for this on Biden by saying that Biden's agreement earlier this year to allow $6 billion in Iranian assets to be unfrozen in return for Iran's release of American hostages aided Hamas. This is a false claim because none of that money had been dispersed yet. So there's no way any of that money could have helped Hamas. The money hadn't even gone into Iran yet. But that was an effort by Republicans to score political points on this issue. But at the same time, those Republicans on the policy response by the U.S. have been largely in line with the Biden administration's approach of, taking a pro-Israel stance. Within the Democratic Party, there are starting to be there's starting to be some internal division emerging in the sense that some of the progressives in the party are becoming more critical of Israel's response, calling for Israel to exercise more restraint or calling for a ceasefire. This is so far a view of only a relatively small minority of the Democratic Party. Most Democrats are still generally, expressing strong support for Israel, but there's, the emergence of more vocal statements among some progressives that are strongly critical of Israel in terms of its response in Gaza, the military response in Gaza. Okay. Lastly, and I'm going to stop in a few minutes, but I just want to quickly talk about a couple kind of related items before we turn it over to Q&A. So one additional question, what I did so far was, giving a lot of illustrations of bipartisanship, different kinds of bipartisanship, polarization. An additional question is, well, why do members of Congress relate to each other in these different ways? What are factors that influence how Democrats and Republicans line up with each other or against each other when it comes to foreign policy? And I think there are a few factors that are important. I go into a lot of detail in this in the book here. I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on these, but I'm happy to talk about any of them more in the Q&A. One is a feeling of national security threats. Generally, when America is facing a greater sense of international threat, Americans feel that the country is at risk in a security standpoint. That leads to more bipartisanship. Democrats and Republicans tend to kind of rally around the flag and be more cooperative with each other. In addition, ideology can come into play. And by that, I mean, there are some foreign policy issues where a liberal position is clearly at odds with a conservative position. In other words, the debate neatly breaks down on a left-right ideological spectrum. So think about issues involving taxes and spending. If you're a liberal, almost by definition, you think you favor government programs to address social welfare problems, and so as a result, you're willing to support taxes to fund government programs. And if you're a conservative, almost by definition, you favor lower taxes, and you want to have a smaller government role in the economy. And so on that type of issue, Democrats and Republicans are always going to be opposed to each other. But on many foreign policy issues, there's not necessarily a distinct liberal position and a distinct conservative position. So if you think about issues like U.S. policy toward China, whether the United States should intervene militarily in a civil war in a place like Syria, there's not necessarily a distinct liberal position and a distinct conservative position on that type of issue. A third factor that can matter is advocacy groups or interest groups. There are some issues where advocacy groups themselves push the two parties apart. The way that happens is there are some advocacy groups that have close ties to one party, and there are some advocacy groups that have close ties to the other party. And on that issue, they will tend to sort of push politicians further apart from each other. This is true of an issue like abortion, where Democrats are closely aligned with pro-choice groups, Republicans are closely aligned with anti-abortion groups, and when those groups are active in debates, they're going to tend to push Democrats and Republicans apart. There are other issues, including many on foreign policy, where advocacy groups are not so important, so politicians have more leeway to take different positions, or if they are important, they have ties to both parties, and so they're not necessarily pushing the politicians apart. Defense spending would be a good example of this, where defense contractors, businesses that produce military equipment tend to lobby the government for military spending, and they have close ties to both parties. Last factor that can be important is institutional incentives. And by this, I mean, sometimes the president has a different incentive on an issue than a member of Congress, and this leads to clashes between the two branches. And typically, this comes into play because the president is responsible for U.S. diplomacy, is viewed as being responsible for the big picture in American foreign policy, overall national interests, whereas members of Congress are not really held accountable for the kind of overall success of U.S. foreign policy. They are often more responsive to particular constituencies that they represent. And so sometimes there's a tension between the president and Congress because they're kind of focused on different concerns or motivated by different considerations. Lastly, why does all this matter? So why should we care about whether issues are polarized or whether there's some degree of bipartisanship? First of all, I just want to say that I would not argue that bipartisanship is always good and polarization is always bad. When bipartisanship becomes kind of unthinking agreement or a groupthink, that's not healthy. It is important in our society to have vigorous domestic debate over policy. That can be healthy and productive, and it sometimes can ensure that our government doesn't make bad mistakes. Sometimes when there's been strong bipartisanship, it's been in support of a bad policy decision, like the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq in 2003. That had strong bipartisan support, turned out to be a very bad decision. Or the decision of Lyndon Johnson to escalate in Vietnam, that initially had strong bipartisan support, turned out to be a bad decision. But generally, polarization creates greater problems for U.S. foreign policy. First of all, strong polarization results in sharp policy swings when a president from a different party takes office. And we've seen this in recent years, going from Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Each of them changed foreign policy in some dramatic ways from their predecessor. And this makes the United States inconsistent. It undermines the durability and effectiveness of U.S. foreign policy when policies are changing from one president to the next in such significant ways. Secondly, divisions, whether they're divisions between the two parties or within a party, make it harder for Congress to act. They make it harder for Congress to pass legislation that's needed to address important international issues. We're seeing that with Ukraine aid, where the division within the Republican Party is making it harder for Congress to approve that. They also make it harder for Congress to approve treaties that are negotiated by the president. And divisions weaken the reliability of U.S. commitments. They make it harder for the United States to convince other countries that they can rely on the United States. Because if you're another country and you're thinking of partnering with the United States, joining hands with the United States on an important issue, why would you, make sacrifices toward the United States or try to accommodate the United States or, invest in a partnership with the United States if you don't know whether that commitment from the U.S. president that you might be getting in return is going to be maintained by the president's successor or upheld by Congress? And conversely, bipartisanship enables a more consistent, reliable, effective, sustainable foreign policy. So a couple conclusions. One, polarization is increasing on foreign policy as on domestic policy. So this is not a happy story. There is increased polarization over time, but there's also still bipartisanship in many foreign policy areas. This bipartisanship, though, often coexists with intra-party division. So we don't necessarily have unity just because we have some Democrats and Republicans cooperating. And thirdly, opportunities for bipartisanship on foreign policy will continue to emerge. So, there is a bit of optimism there. I think there will continue to be specific issues where Democrats and Republicans work together, even as the overall landscape is increasingly polarized. And I'll just close by noting that if you're interested in purchasing the book, you can purchase it with a 30% discount code at this website that I've got on this last slide using a certain code that's indicated there. So thanks so much. I look forward to the questions, and I'll turn it back over to Jane.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And we want to reassure people, we will send the link to the book with the code in our follow-up notes, so you don't have to try to quickly write that down from his screen share. Jordan, we really appreciate the work that you've done for this book and your timely topic. We've got a couple of questions as people have been listening, and one of them is that you focused on the votes, and that was sort of readily identifiable to look at partisanship. Is there any way that you have looked at about measuring the rhetoric and the depth of the rhetoric?
I haven't looked at the rhetoric. That's a great question, and it's a great point that, looking at votes alone is not really sufficient to get a full understanding of how Democrats and Republicans are relating to each other, because our elected officials do a lot of other things besides voting, and rhetoric is certainly really important. There's no doubt that rhetoric overall has become more partisan in recent years. There's more harsh, hostile rhetoric toward members of the other party in our, national life than there used to be. It's worth noting, though, that even during the height of the Cold War, which we tend to think of as a time when politics stopped at the water's edge and Democrats and Republicans were all friendly toward each other and all on the same page, even during the height of the Cold War, there were debates that were kind of intense partisan fights. And there was some pretty strong, nasty rhetoric then, too. If you think of the McCarthy era during the early 1950s, this is the height of the Cold War, an era when generally we think of there being a lot of bipartisanship. But you had a Senator, Joseph McCarthy, accusing members of the Truman administration of being communists, and there was a lot of very bitter language. When the Communist Revolution succeeded in China in 1949, Harry Truman was the president. Republicans in Congress went after Truman really aggressively for, quote, losing China. This was a strong charge they made against Truman in the 1950 congressional election. So the point is just that we shouldn't think that nasty rhetoric is new. It's been around a long time. In the 19th century, there were fights on the floor of the House and Senate, physical fights as well as verbal ones. But I think it's become more prevalent and pervasive in recent years, and the use of social media has intensified that, where politicians and their staff and party activists are regularly kind of vilifying political opponents on social media. And that's really corrosive to our democracy.
And no question about that. Now, one of the things in an essay you authored about can Democrats and Republicans still cooperate on foreign policy? You wrote that bipartisanship today is usually not synonymous with national unity, and it's difficult for the United States to talk with one voice or act as a reliable partner on the global stage. In the context of what's going on today, how do you see that observation playing out?
Yeah, I think it's very evident today. It's most evident with regard to Ukraine, to take one example. So the Biden administration, I think, has handled the war in Ukraine very well in terms of strongly supporting Ukraine, marshaling a vast amount of kind of resources in terms of aid to Ukraine, and working with allies and partners to build support for Ukraine in other parts of the world as well, especially in Europe. And to the extent Congress was supporting that by providing funding for aid to Ukraine, the Biden administration was able to carry out that policy in a way that gave it the maximum opportunity for success. And that's what's allowed Ukraine to fight Russia to a stalemate, basically, even though Russia otherwise would have much more superior military power. And now the fact that the Congress is not approving further aid to Ukraine threatens to really undermine the U.S. policy. So Biden has been saying the United States will stand by Ukraine, that the U.S. is going to make a long-term commitment to Ukraine. But if Congress won't provide more aid to Ukraine, then that's an empty commitment, and Biden will look like he was misleading Ukraine and leading them along when the United States wasn't actually going to follow through. And that really undermines U.S. credibility when the president makes a commitment to another country and then the Congress doesn't back it up, or the president's successor doesn't back it up.
And one of the questions that came through from our listeners, you may not know the answer to, but we're all sort of poised and watching the speakers debate, and it appears that there may be a bipartisan vote on the speaker. Can you tell us, what percentage of parties have voted for the opposite party for the speaker? Has that?
Zero. That's an easy one. As far as I know, I shouldn't say that definitively because I haven't actually researched it, but I don't believe it's ever been the case that members of the other party have voted for, that a speaker has gotten votes from the other party. It's always been the norm as long as I've been following politics, certainly, that only members of the speaker candidate's own party vote for that person for speaker. The members of the other party never vote for them because they would want someone from their own party to be speaker. So I think this would be unprecedented. Okay, I'm wrong. Somebody is pointing out. So somebody had a better historical knowledge than I do. Thank you for adding that. Somebody put it in the chat.
There's one Republican who used to vote for Tip O'Neill.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. Well, it's certainly
this is our audience. There's always
it's
somebody.
great to have a smart audience. So it's certainly rare, though, and certainly hasn't happened in recent years. So I don't know if it's happened at all since the 1980s. Maybe that was the last time it happened, when O'Neill was speaker.
And one more question. You look at sort of decades of foreign policy, and can you tell us, one of the things that often is part of our foreign policy is not just military activity, but global health.
Yeah.
How do you see bipartisan in approaching global health matters?
Yeah, good question. And that questioner may be thinking of a particular program called PEPFAR, which stands for President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And this is a really interesting issue. It's worth, I think, spending a couple minutes on it. So when George W. Bush was president in the early 2000s, he proposed the creation of a major global health initiative called PEPFAR that would provide large amounts of funding to prevent and treat HIV/AIDS in developing countries, particularly in Africa, where rates of HIV infection were very high. And this proposal got strong bipartisan support from Congress starting about 20 years ago. And over the past 20 years, it was repeatedly renewed, reauthorized with new appropriations of funding with strong bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans in large majorities have voted for this program repeatedly over the last 20 years. And the U.S., collectively over these years has spent many billions of dollars to, prevent and treat HIV/AIDS in poor countries, and this has saved millions of lives. There have been studies showing that this has saved millions of lives around the world. Now, for the first time, this program is becoming a subject to partisanship and polarization because there are some Republicans in Congress and some influential Republicans who are now coming out against reauthorizing this program and spending, and appropriating new funds for this program based on a position they're taking that some of the organizations that the United States gives money to implement these anti-HIV/AIDS programs provide family planning services in the countries in which they operate, meaning some of these local organizations provide abortion services in developing countries. And so anti-abortion groups have become activated on this and are saying we shouldn't provide any of this funding because some of the funding goes to organizations that provide abortions, even though none of the U.S. funding goes to the provision of abortions. It just goes to organizations that some of them also provide abortion services. So this is very unfortunate because this program has been very effective, but it may not get reauthorized because of this new issue that's been raised by anti-abortion activists.
It's good to understand how that loss of bipartisanship can really influence our ability to address matters of global importance.
Yeah.
We're at the end of our moment, and we really want to appreciate the fact that you've been with us, Jordan, that your thoughtful engagement has really given people something to think about. A couple people asked, is this recorded? Yes, it is recorded, and yes, it will be available on our website. We usually get it up within about 24 hours, and so everyone who's registered will get a notice of its availability together with a notice about the book and that opportunity. So we also want to remind everyone that this kind of conversation, we think of it as enlightened conversation that leads toward informed patriotism, is available only because of the support of the members and friends of the United States Capitol Historical Society. So we appreciate you being with us today. We encourage all of you who are listening to make sure you join as members and encourage your friends to make a contribution. As we look ahead, we have some very interesting things coming up. We have another book talk with Fergus Bordewick, whose new book has come out about the Ku Klux Klan and the engagement with Ulysses Grant and the battle to save Reconstruction, coming up Thursday, November 16th. We also have one that we're working on a date. Judge Burt Griffin from Cleveland, Ohio, was on the staff of the Warren Commission and has written a new book about his experience there called JFK, Oswald, and Ruby, Politics, Prejudice, and the Truth. So stay tuned for that. And we just got news that our conversation with Dr. Robert Watson about When Washington Burned, which was done in person here at the VFW building, will be airing on C-SPAN on Saturday, October 28th at 6:06 p.m. on C-SPAN 2. And once it airs, it will also be available on our YouTube. So we are grateful for all of your conversation. We are grateful to you, Professor Tama, for being with us. And thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Be well. Goodbye.